Greetings. I am Dr. Graciela Canedo Livingston, Provost at Nebraska Wesleyan University. I want to welcome you to this year's presentation of Spooky Evenings. We here at Nebraska Wesleyan are excited and proud of this event that brings together scholars, artists, authors, and filmmakers to discuss the topic of horror in its various manifestations across the arts and the humanities. Professor Juan Jose Castaño Marquez and Dr. Matthew Jarvis have been working tirelessly to bring you the best scholarship in the field of horror through this unparalleled digital humanities event. I would like to acknowledge the generous support from the Nebraska Arts Council, Humanities Nebraska, and the Nebraska Cultural Endowment that helps make quality programming like Spooky Evenings possible. Again, welcome and enjoy this presentation of Spooky Evenings.
Tonight on Spooky Evenings, Dr. Esther Hamori of Union Theological Seminary, giving her talk entitled, The Biblical God and His Entourage of Monsters, or, And You Thought the Devil Was Bad. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my guest, Dr. Esther Hamori. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's a fantastic series, and I'm delighted to be a part of it. I've gotten to see a few of the previous presentations, and very happy to be here. Thank you.
There's actually a lot of excitement for you tonight, so no pressure at all. I've actually gotten a few emails over the last week and a half about this talk, so you have some fans out there eagerly awaiting you tonight.
Good, thank you.
No pressure, no pressure. So your talk tonight is The Biblical God and His Entourage of Monsters, or And You Thought the Devil Was Bad. So I kept getting that title wrong today on social media, for which I apologize. I turned it into a very 19th century sounding title.
You thought the devil bad.
Yeah, it was very, very right. Proper and high tea.
Right.
Sorry, I just activated Siri by accident. So I'll turn it over to you, God and the Monsters.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. But before I start, I have to tell you that your theme music that you've chosen for the series, the Sarasate violin piece, Secret Horizon, I have a long history with this piece. I was once upon a time a serious violinist, and that piece was one of my favorite things to play as a kid. I stopped playing for a long time, and a couple years ago, took out the violin and I started playing that piece, which, as you know, having chosen it, is flashy and dramatic. Started playing it for my kid, who was, I'm going to say 2 at the time, and he was totally unimpressed. And then I started playing Baby Shark, and he got so excited he peed in his pants. So I'm a Sarasate fan, but apparently we have to grow into that. Anyway, I love that you chose that as your theme music. So
we clearly do not care for the flashy or dramatic here at all. I just,
naturally. Right. All right.
So on that note of comedy.
Yes, yes. My talk today comes out of my new book on biblical monsters, which I hope you and everyone watching this will read. I'm going to guess a year from now. I don't have a date on that yet. But these biblical monsters have been hiding in plain sight for a long time, and I am excited to unleash them on the world. So, in 1589, a German farmer named Peter Stump, who would eventually become known as the Werewolf of Bedburg, experienced an unfortunate turn of events. As the story goes, a wolf had been attacking his village, and a villager managed to relieve the wolf of its front left paw, shortly after which Peter Stump was discovered with a severed left hand. And it didn't go well after that for Farmer Stump. That story has stuck with me since a fateful library visit at the age of about 10. Clearly, monsters can be memorable, compelling, lots of fun, but they're also deadly serious. Monsters have meaning. Wherever they appear, they reflect something about what their creators think, how they see the world. Classic example that I think we've even heard about in this series so far, how Dracula reflects anxieties about sexuality, class, immigration. Monsters raise questions. Monsters make you think. Scholars in a lot of fields have taken seriously that we learn something from looking at monsters and thinking about their functions, literary studies, psychology, philosophy. And this is not a quirky modern interest. For example, in one of the many places where Augustine, that's early 5th century, where Augustine writes about monsters, he explains that they're called monsters because they demonstrate something. Latin monstra, a monstrando. Augustine argues that monsters are a way to know something about God, and for him, something wonderful. And I do think that biblical monsters show us something about the biblical God character. Though, as you'll see, I'm not sure that what they show is so wonderful. A few biblical monsters are pretty well known. Leviathan gets a lot of press. Satan gets called a monster. But here's the thing. The Bible is full of monsters. But they can be hard to recognize because they've been domesticated, tamed by time and tradition. Now, when I talk about various figures in the Bible as monsters, it's because based on their form and function, if they appeared anywhere else, Greek mythology, Netflix, we would know to identify them as monsters. Anywhere other than the Bible, they're monsters when it's the Bible too. If we take a couple minutes to think about common monster traits, we'll be better able to recognize them, I think, when they come up in the Bible. So there's no single defining trait that all monsters share. Instead, as with biological family resemblance, there are classic family traits that all monsters draw from in different combinations, remarkably across time periods, cultures, genres. No monster has all of these traits. All monsters have some. So very briefly, the most common traits of the monster family. Giant size. We have here the Kraken and friends, Godzilla and Yeti, Alcyoneus about to be. Then superhuman or supernatural strength and powers that can go along with giant size, of course, or not, like Lilith on Supernatural, Chucky and other killer dolls. Chucky's coming back. I'm so excited. Then a very common trait, hybridity. First, physical hybridity, the mixing of two or more species. Again, all of these cross time periods, cultures, genres. Ty-bird monsters, centaurs, sharktopus. Then there is hybridity beyond the physical. unnatural category combinations like living and dead, animate and inanimate, like my personal favorite, the vengeful vehicle subgenre. And hybridity also includes other kinds of category violations, like crossing between cosmic realms, right? A dead person isn't a monster until it shows up in your house. Or another kind of category violation, shifting shapes, which brings us back to Farmer Stump, or in this case, poor David Kessler of American Werewolf in London, and zombie pirates who appear as fog. Sticking with the fog, after shape-shifting, the fog exemplifies another type of bizarre form, the amorphous monster. You might think of Ovid's chaos, a raw, unordered mass. Again, all of these cross time periods, etc. And the flip side of bizarre form, formlessness. And then there are the monsters that would seem natural if only they showed up alone. One bird, fine. Birds attacking en masse, monstrous. Next to the birds here, we have Kingdom of the Spiders. Noel Carroll, in his book, The Philosophy of Horror, calls this phenomenon massification. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. The last common feature of monster life I'll mention here is monster geography. Monsters generally dwell outside of human society, lurking elsewhere and beyond. Here, the depths of the sea, the upside down, behind the crack in the wall. And this would be fine if they would stay elsewhere and beyond, which of course they never do. The biblical world is full of monsters exhibiting all of these classic monster traits in varying combinations, just like the rest of the monster world. Monsters, in fact, fill every part of the biblical universe, the heavens and the earth, under the earth, and the depths of the sea. On the earth, this is a lightning tour. On the earth, there are warrior giants, one type of which is even presented as a hybrid of natural and supernatural species. Under the earth, there are ghosts that chirp and mutter and occasionally arise from the grave to interfere with the living. In the sea, there are gigantic and looming sea monsters, indescribable here and multi-headed there. And the first three of these, giants on the earth, ghosts beneath, the monsters of the wine dark sea, they show up most often as God's opponents in conflict with God. And each of them might do some damage, but nothing compared to the monsters in heaven. As the biblical monster population comes into focus, one chilling feature stands out. Most of the monsters of the Bible, and notably the most deadly and dangerous of them, those that kill the most people, aren't God's opponents. They're his entourage. So allow me to introduce today three of God's monsters. I have chosen those with the most familiar names to introduce today. We'll start with a story from the book of Numbers. If you're looking it up, it's Numbers 21. Once upon a time, the Israelites complained that they were dying in the wilderness. And to be fair, they were. But God sees this as insufficient reverence and says, essentially, I'll show you death in the wilderness, and sends snakes to kill them. It's an incredible picture of massification, puts the birds to shame as hordes of snakes come and kill a whole slew of people. It's horrifying. And if that hive mind attack isn't scary enough, these aren't your everyday snakes. These snakes have a special name, Seraphim. Now, before continuing that story, the best known seraphim of the Bible are the heavenly creatures in the prophet Isaiah's vision of God seated on the throne, surrounded by 6 winged seraphim that fly around and cry, "Holy, holy, holy." they later get conflated with angels, but in the Bible, they're a distinct supernatural species. But Isaiah's famous seraphim aren't the main type of seraphim in the Bible. They're just a small part of a network of related creatures, all called seraphim. And there are two varieties, heavenly and earthly. On earth, seraphim are snakes, and half the time they're explicitly snakes with wings. And where in the Bible should we find these flying seraphim snakes? Also in Isaiah, and even in the same general part of the book, which scholars call First Isaiah. The heavenly beings Isaiah describes as seraphim flying around God's throne are clearly related to the earthly creatures he calls flying seraphim, which are explicitly a type of snake. It helps to know a bit about where this idea comes from. Seraphim are descended from the Egyptian uraeus, which is the image of a rearing cobra ready to strike, and sometimes with wings. You're looking at the so-called King Tut mask and throne, and an Egyptian late period gold amulet. I think the serpentine form with wings is especially clear on the arm of the throne there. We also have clay seals with uraeus images from the time and place of the prophet Isaiah, 8th century Judah. Let's call that broadly the region around Jerusalem, so you don't have to whip out your maps. The original idea of the uraeus is that the venomous snake protects and avenges the god, specifically by spitting fire, that is venom, on the god's enemies. And representations of the uraeus, like that gold amulet, representations of the uraeus, remember this for a minute, were also used for magical protection from snake bites. This is called sympathetic magic, the use of the image to affect the thing it represents. So the image of the uraeus was associated with both avenging the god and healing the people. Avenging the god with fiery venom and healing the people through magic. Coming back to our original story from the Book of Numbers, I think, let's look at these clearly serpentine winged folks here. So coming back to our original story from the Book of Numbers, God has just committed mass execution by snake, and his next move is to offer healing, at least to those not dead yet. He tells Moses to make a bronze seraph, the image of the very monster he just sent to attack the people, and to raise it up on a pole, and those who gaze upon it will be healed. This use of the image for sympathetic magic, like a snake amulet to heal a snake bite, is clearly at home in the uraeus tradition. But what's the bigger picture here? God uses seraphim in this story in Numbers in ways that reflect both aspects of the uraeus. First, to spit burning venom to avenge the offended god and kill his enemies, who in this story are his people, and then to offer protection. So this is protection kind of in the mafia sense, right? God has inflicted near fatal injuries on the wanderers and is now offering to heal them for a price. He's incensed at the people's insubordination. He sends his heavies to do his dirty work. And after the people are gravely injured and many are dead, he requires that they pay homage to the symbol of his power. He extorts protection against the deadly assault he just orchestrated. So those who are willing to kiss the ring will live. And as far as we know, the seraphim snakes are still there when God makes the people this offer they can't refuse. There are also threatening reminders of this incident in a couple of other biblical texts. where the Israelites are accused of showing insufficient reverence, where you can practically see the knuckle cracking. Like, remember those seraphim snakes? I can do that again. It's terrible. It's wonderful. Then we come to the vision of the prophet Isaiah, who's called upon to give a message to other people God sees as insufficiently compliant. The seraphim he describes are the outliers, the heavenly beings, utterly hybrid with 6 wings and human hands, and we should assume serpentine bodies, since this is what seraphim already means, including in Isaiah's own references to earthly seraphim snakes. Remember those clay seals with the serpentine bodies and the wings. And Isaiah's heavenly seraphim appear as a kind of divine drum roll for a disturbing prophetic message. God, sitting there surrounded by seraphim, is going to send a prophet, and he asks, who will go for us? For us. Like in some other biblical texts, God uses the first person plural, we, us, to refer to the heavenly population, like all the little heavenly beings running around up there with him. And in this case, the referent is visible right there flying around God's throne. The seraphim are included in the sending of the message. And the disturbing prophetic message in this case is that Isaiah should keep the people from being healed. So back in the desert disaster sequence in Numbers 21, God's refusal to heal the people who didn't pay homage by looking to the bronze seraph might have seemed monstrous. In Isaiah's vision, even that limited healing has been taken off the table. In each case, God uses the seraphim, heavenly and earthly, and including those knuckle-cracking reminder texts. In each case, God uses the seraphim to injure, threaten, or kill people he deems insufficiently reverent. The seraphim serve the classic monster function of frightening people into conventional behavior. The seraphim are the behavioral border guard sent by God to kill or intimidate people into compliance. Next, the cherubim. These are creatures so utterly tamed and domesticated that they've been literally infantilized, right? Now pictured as happy fat angel babies. But before that, they were massive, menacing winged animal guardians. The cherubim appear in a bunch of different forms in the Bible. At their core, they're hybrid guardian monsters. This is a common idea in the ancient Near East. Here are a couple of examples: statues of winged lions and bulls standing guard in Assyrian palaces. Just to give you a sense of the broader tradition of hybrid monsters that functioned as guardians of the gateways. The first time we meet cherubim in the Bible, God has just chucked Adam and Eve out of the garden, and he stations cherubim there to guard the gateway to Eden. This is a fleeting appearance. Their form isn't specified, but their function could hardly be clearer. They guard sacred space. The implication is obviously also that they're menacing enough to keep people out of Eden. Elsewhere in the Bible, we get a clearer picture of their form, not of living heavenly cherubim, but descriptions of statues of cherubim in the tabernacle and the Jerusalem temple. I'm going to stick to one example today, the tabernacle. Keep in mind that the tabernacle wasn't just a house of worship the way people might think of it now. It was presented as the place where God dwells. More precisely, in this description in the book of Exodus, God is said to dwell in one location within the tabernacle, a carefully designed spot in the back room where the Ark of the Covenant resides. And the very heart of the tabernacle is the Ark's cover, the so-called mercy seat. That's the holy X where God is going to touch down, the precise spot where he says his presence will dwell above the mercy seat. And built onto the top of the mercy seat, one on each end, are 2 gold cherubim, spreading out their wings above the ark, overshadowing the mercy seat, standing guard at that sacred spot. Now, never one for subtlety, God also orders that more cherubim be embroidered into the partition within the tabernacle and even more into the outer curtains, like guards at every checkpoint, a built-in string of bouncers. There's a bit more to the detail. There's a bit more detail, to the description of the golden cherubim, though. They spread out their wings above the ark, overshadowing the mercy seat, the cover, and they face in. Pause to picture that. The cherubim, one at each end of the ark, face one another. They're also described as looking toward the cover. In other words, the cherubim atop the ark face in and down. So it's not just the ark of or the divine presence they're protecting. It's not only the people they're keeping away from the ark, right? That would be a very different position. But the one on the mercy seat, in and down, the one on the mercy seat they're keeping in. The cherubim symbolically prevent passage between realms in both directions. Now that's often part of the job description of hybrid guardian monsters, like Cerberus, who guards the gates of the underworld in Greek mythology, so the dead can't escape, excuse me, and the living can't enter. The cherubim serve as a safeguard against unauthorized movement between realms. The idea of hemming God in might sound odd to us, but it wouldn't have been a weird idea to the writers who reflect on the deadly, dangerous presence of God all the time. Like in Exodus 19, people are warned not to even touch the foot of Mount Sinai, where God descends onto the peak, because when God is on the summit, even base camp is deadly. Then we come to the prophet Ezekiel, who describes visions of 4 living cherubim, initially called the 4 living creatures. That'll come up again in the New Testament, which I'll talk about in a minute. These cherubim are, at least in Ezekiel's first description, they're partly humanoid, but with 4 wings each, hooves, little hooves, it says, little hooves, human hands under each wing, and 4 faces each. Those of a human being, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. So composite creatures don't get much more composite, at least until their wheels appear and eyes in the wheels, with the spirit of the 4 living creatures in the wheels. Ezekiel's cherubim have become a living chariot. So with all due respect to Stephen King, Christine's got nothing on this. I once had my Monster Heaven seminar try to draw Ezekiel's chariot. It's delightful. The main function of the cherubim in Ezekiel, this living chariot, is to whisk God away when he decides to jump ship and abandon Jerusalem. This is also part of their role as guardians of the gateways, like the scorpion people in Mesopotamian mythology, who guard the gates of the sun and they usher the sun god through. The cherubim now usher God through the gateway, up and away. One thing leads to another, and God tells a divine executioner to burn Jerusalem to the ground. But the executioner needs a weapon. One of the cherubim grabs burning coals to hand to the executioner, who's going to burn it all down. This is the first time, but not the last, that we see cherubim in this role, the role of weapons master. Remember all that divine danger the cherubim were keeping at bay, facing in and down? Now it becomes clear what all of that divine danger was. It's violent, bloody, fiery mass destruction. God orders the death of every adult and child throughout the entire city, and the cherubim do their job as weapons handler. When God says to burn it all down, they grab the glowing coals. Now, sometimes when I teach or give talks about God's monsters, people initially assume I'm talking about the Old Testament, because that's the violent part, right? Hate to break it to you. Narrator, she does not hate to break it. Later theological developments, like what we see in the New Testament, do affect God's entourage. For example, the functionary later known as Satan is extracted eventually from the company of God and made ruler of his own evil domain. But other members of God's entourage remain, and the New Testament generally ratchets up the violence they commit on God's behalf. Ezekiel's 4 living creatures reappear in the book of Revelation, the New Testament book of Revelation. They've now morphed into a conflation of cherubim and seraphim, with some exciting new features. Each one looks like a different animal rather than having 4 faces each, as in Ezekiel. But they each have 6 wings and sing, "Holy, holy, holy," like the seraphim of Isaiah's vision. So they're now hybrids of hybrids. They no longer form a living chariot with eyes in its wheels. Now, in Revelation, the eyes have crawled up onto the bodies of the creatures themselves. The cherubim serve 3 functions in Revelation. First, the innocuous role, they worship. Great, so they're explicitly among the company of God, acting in his service. Check. Second function. Ever hear of the 4 horsemen who come to bring catastrophe to the earth and its inhabitants? The destruction is horrifying. This is why they're on every TV show that tries to deal with anything cosmic. They bring war, starvation, pestilence. But the 4 horsemen can't just cross between realms as they please, riding from heaven down into the earthly domain. There's a gateway, and we have come to know the guardians. For each horseman's entry, one of the next-gen cherubim says, "Come." One by one, they each beckon one of the horsemen standing at the checkpoint and waving them through. The monstrous guardians are again stationed at a cosmic gateway. Only, unfortunately for humankind, it's not to guard us. Just as in Ezekiel, they usher God out, in Revelation, they usher the horsemen in. The third function in the New Testament only gets worse. Later in Revelation, there are 7 angels who are going to unload on humankind 7 horrific plagues from God. And each plague is held in a golden bowl, and the angels are going to pour their plague bowls of doom out onto the earth to kill and destroy. And how do the angelic killers get their plague bowls of death, their divine weapons of mass destruction? From the weapons master. Remember that cherub in Ezekiel handing the burning coal to the divine executioner? The writer of Revelation explains, one of the 4 living creatures gave the 7 angels 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God. So the 4 living creatures, members of God's entourage to the end, are still stationed at the cosmic gateway to beckon the destroyers of humankind, and they still act as weapons master. What does change in the New Testament is that, unfortunately for humankind, God's monsters have expanded their turf, and it's no longer just the city of Jerusalem or the region of Judah that they aim to destroy. It's now the entire doomed earth. Later on, Seraphim and Cherubim were both conflated with a third distinct supernatural species, angels. And somehow in the popular imagination, this makes Seraphim and Cherubim seem nicer. It shouldn't. Angels, who have acquired the soft-edged glow of a Hallmark card, are deadly, shape-shifting, realm-crossing, divine hitmen with the terrible combination of having lethal superpowers and the ability to cross realms to use them. One time, King David orders a census, and God punishes this with the slaughter of 70,000 innocent civilians. Innocent. This is to punish David. The people didn't do anything wrong. The figure he brings in for the job is called the Destroying Angel. Now, the Destroying Angel is giant. It hovers between heaven and earth, right, way up in the sky, but it can still be seen. It's giant, and it stretches out its supernatural sword over all of Jerusalem. So the giant angel shoots pestilence out of its supernatural sword as it hovers between realms. This is one classic monster trait after another. The giant size, realm crossing, here using a supernatural weapon. And everyone in the story is terrified. Again, everyone who's still alive. We track their fear through the story. From the moment people look up and see the giant angel looming overhead, to some characters as they hide, to King David, who ends up so afraid that he finds he can't engage with God as he used to. That's how the story ends. It's a horror movie. One moment of killing, one verse, 15 verses of fear. Now, this image, which I already question my choice to show you, this image might not immediately get the terror across, but just so that we don't read on autopilot, enter the world of the story, if you will, where people look up at this giant danger looming above them, shooting down its death rays. 70,000 people have died in this story so far. All right, this angel is giant, hovering between realms. Some other angels in the Bible show up on foot, indistinguishable from human beings, when that's what best serves their purposes. Then there's an angel taking utterly non-anthropomorphic form and even shifting shape during the course of a single story. Cloud by day, fire by night. That angel is leading the Israelites wandering through the wilderness. And this is how you get seen from afar in the desert. Again, a questionable image choice. However, just to make sure that this fit of form to function is really clear, the angel takes the form that suits the job of the moment. Cloud by day, fire by night. I'll tell you that this led me down quite a rabbit hole. You'd be amazed what's on survivalist websites. Anyway, angels take different forms for different purposes. In any context other than the Bible, we'd call those shapeshifters. So, angels are shapeshifters. They're also the ultimate realm crossers. Other divine beings in the Bible have the ability to move between realms too, but angels are built for it. It's their defining feature. Which would be fine, except that the reason is so often to kill people. To pick just a couple of so many possible examples in the Bible, there's the angel who kills 185,000 Assyrians while they're sleeping. Sometimes it's more intimate and targeted, like the armed angel who comes after the prophet Balaam and tries to execute him, while Balaam is doing exactly what God just told him to do. That angel is explicitly human-sized, by the way. He can fit into a small space that Balaam's donkey gets into. If anyone was hoping that at least angels would be better in the New Testament, sorry. Consider the divine response in the book of Acts when King Herod Agrippa makes a grand entrance before a crowd and the people greet him as a god, and he fails to correct them. An angel strikes Agrippa, who is eaten by worms and dies. Eaten by worms, then dies, not the other way around. And if this doesn't sound like horror to you, and there we have the book of Acts. And then, of course, there are the horrifying angels of Revelation, angels who destroy huge slices of the earth and kill massive portions of the human population, and with relish, like an A-team of killer angels whom God has kept chained up and held back just to be let out to reap destruction at the perfect moment. And like the angels I mentioned earlier, who are deployed to pour out their plague bowls on humankind, handed to them by the weapons master. So cherubic, and so on. Even angels, the divine beings in God's entourage who are most associated with benevolence and protection, just do that when it's the task at hand. In the Bible, angels are the obedient servants of God, and when their command is to deliver a message, they do. And when it's to execute a single target or slaughter multitudes of innocent civilians, they do. Crossing between realms to do so, using lethal superpowers and shifting shapes to suit the needs of the moment. This is the tip of the iceberg. Like any good entourage, God's company includes a wide range of types and specialties. The big picture is like a divine Ocean's 11. So we've just met two very different kinds of hybrid creatures, each with their own set of functions in the entourage. And we've seen realm-crossing, shape-shifting ultimate soldiers. The monsters of God's entourage whom we're not meeting today include, among others, the enhanced interrogation specialist and demons who are part of the company of God, specific named demons known from other ancient Near Eastern literature, but half hidden in the Bible. And I can't leave you tonight without at least mentioning one of my personal favorites, a shapeshifter of an altogether different kind, the gaslighting spirit. In a bunch of texts, God deploys a spirit to mess with the minds of people he opposes. It's a diverse entourage. These spirits are usually invisible, which is perfectly suited to supernatural psyop work. But at one point, we also get to see one in physical form, pre-deployment, standing and walking around, before shapeshifting into another classic monstrous mode, the formless menace. And by the way, in most of the half dozen or so texts where God dispatches the spirit to screw with people, those people end up dead. So God sends the spirit to gaslight people to death. But we'll have to wait for the book to meet those monsters and several others. The most vicious monsters of the Bible, those described as killing the most people, are the monsters of God's entourage, explicitly portrayed as acting in God's employ. It's a God who sends varieties of hybrid creatures on the attack, dispatches gaslighting spirits, deploys demons, and repeatedly orchestrates targeted executions and the mass slaughter of civilians by his divine hitmen, angelic and otherwise. His entourage is filled with diverse ranks of deadly figures waiting to be deployed, the massive and the formless, crossing realms and shifting shapes with too many wings and too many faces. In fact, every single type of divine being that is shown acting in the service of God in the Bible injures, tortures, threatens death, or kills on his command. Each type of divine being in God's entourage has its own profile, its characteristic set of job responsibilities, and every single one of them includes doing horrific violence against human beings on God's orders. So, the way in which I am most like Augustine is that I think biblical monsters demonstrate something about the biblical God character. These monsters have been tamed by time and tradition, and the biblical God monster has also been tamed. In the Bible, God is the head of an entourage of monsters that he sends into the world to do his monstrous bidding, come what may. There's another divine being in the Bible whose wickedness gets more press, but the most problematic character in the Bible is God. Now, for some Bible readers, this raises important questions, and I deal with those issues elsewhere, but it's not been my main agenda for this spooky evening. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for being patient with us. And I'm going to go with the cherubim tonight. A couple questions for you, if I may.
Yeah.
How do you delineate in terms of other monsters that we didn't quite get to, but are sometimes classified under these ranks? For instance, Thomas Aquinas classifies Satan as a cherubim, if I'm correct.
So I didn't know that. That's fascinating and bizarre. But a lot of these categories shift as time goes on. There's early Christian writing in which there are very careful hierarchies and all kinds of new categories within them, and species that are completely distinct in the Bible merged together, and then there are entirely new inventions because these ideas are compelling and bizarre, and so people knit them in all different ways as time goes on. So as long as we're not trying to read backwards, we're fine, right? It's fascinating to see that in early Christian literature, or later in Aquinas, whatever, that people have developing ideas, as long as we're clear that we're not reading backwards from those later ideas into what's in the Bible itself, right? And even within the Bible, right? People very often read back from, say, a New Testament interpretation into the Hebrew Bible, or even from an early Christian interpretation back into the New Testament with ideas that aren't there. Lucifer's not a fallen angel in the Bible. There's no Lucifer. What? That's later. So there are lots of fascinating developments, and it's just important to keep clear on what comes when.
It's also in terms of what comes when, in terms of like what the cherubim look like and how you describe them with the four faces, they become the tetralogy later.
Yeah, so this is a very strange connection, because you don't really want to base something you think is good on the idea of the cherubim, who are violent and deadly. But later interpreters want to make everything good, and so there's a lot of cleaning things up that happens. So then you can apply older ideas to new pretty things, right? I mean, people think that seraphim are like glowy angels singing. You don't want to meet a seraph. You don't. And then again, you don't want to meet an angel, but There's a lot of scrubbing that goes on.
But I'm curious how they like transform from, this angelic, not angelic, but I mean, it's part of angelology, right? So it is technically angelic. I think
I mean,
everybody,
it shouldn't be.
but
It,
it becomes the apostles, right? It becomes the gospels.
but again, that's a fascinating development. Like when you look at a painting and you see an eagle, and you're supposed to associate that with, I always forget which apostle is supposed to be which. So that's a fascinating development to see these violent, bizarre, hybrid monsters of God's entourage get kind of morphed into symbols of apostles, but we need to not transpose that into anything having to do with the original ideas. So it's really a question of what later interpreters might consider their angelology, if they at that point would use such a word. But if we're going to talk about angels, we can't include biblical cherubim, because within the Bible itself, they're not angels any more than they're apostles or anything else.
It's John who is the eagle, by the way.
John's the eagle, yeah.
It's Matthew. I know I'm man. So you mentioned the scene too from Genesis 3 with the cherubim as well, as sort of like, I guess, the first appearance where we sort of get the taste of them.
Yeah. First, as you open the Bible, if you're reading in order, not first in terms of chronological writing, but
sure.
But yeah, first.
If you're reading it textually, I guess.
Yes, exactly.
I'm wondering too, I mean, we think of Michael as being an archangel, but I mean, it seems he's closer to a cherubim than necessarily an archangel.
So I don't see Michael related to the cherubim either in form or function, but Michael is an interesting development in himself, because he's where you see he's where you see how utterly anthropomorphic angels can be while still being just catapulted up into the heavens. I mean, there are anthropomorphic angels earlier on, of course, but when you get to Michael, you get this sort of the grand cosmic warfare of good and evil battling it out in the heavens, and still with this figure in sort of pretty much utterly anthropomorphic form, which is something we don't see with seraphim or cherubim. I mean, in a way that helps to highlight how these categories that later came together in some interpreters' minds were originally entirely distinct.
It's interesting. I mean, I think it's a more contemporary concept, but I've read in some places, because as you see behind me, I've been reading a lot, particularly about the devil. But it's, I believe, some contemporary scholars read Beelzebub, I believe, as a version of a seraphim as well.
I think that these are powerful ideas and images, and people go fishing.
Sure.
And I mean, kind of anything goes for modern interpretation, as long as you recognize that you're doing something fictional, right? I mean, I'm happy for I'm happy for seraphim to show up in many wildly different forms in comics and TV and poetry today, as long as my students, my readers, understand that that's a modern development, and that early on these were monstrous, bizarre, violent figures deployed by God,
Sure.
which is a much less lovely idea.
Yeah, I mean, because I was thinking too, in relationship to it, I was thinking about, you know, the serpent idea, right? The serpent in the Garden of Eden, right? When you were talking about the serpents, right? But then I also started thinking about things like the Cadecius of Hermes, and I was thinking about the Rod of Escipolis, this is one of my big pet peeves in sort of like graphic design, because people conflate the two, right?
How
But the
dare they?
Cadecius is, I think, what's important here. The Cadecius of Hermes, which is this magical staff that has two snakes on it and wings that transports you from one realm to the next.
Yeah.
Which, that's why I have a pet peeve here, because if a doctor's office is using a Cadecius, that's probably not the doctor you want to be at, right?
Right. I had hoped at one point when I was writing the Seraphim chapter of my book, I had hoped, I looked into that particular imagery, and I had hoped that familiar symbol that you see on an ambulance in a doctor's office, I'd hoped that it came from the Uraeus imagery, via Seraphim, because it is so similar, and healing was one of the functions of the Uraeus. So I kind of liked that idea, but I did end up finding that they're distinct enough so that I couldn't have any fun with it.
Well, I mean, the Rod of Escipolis is only supposed to have one snake. And that's another thing that's changed so much over the time that they've added.
People don't know their ancient monsters. What are we going to do?
I don't. We'll have programs like this where you and I will talk about them. Have you seen Midnight Mass?
I haven't.
I feel like you need to watch Midnight Mass.
Okay.
It's on Netflix. It just came out. It does have this interesting idea about angels and monsters
in a way that I will love or hate.
I think you'll agree with.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I don't want to spoil it too much, because I already spoiled part of it on an earlier episode. But the preacher in the show does constantly reference the "be not afraid" and how everyone is afraid when they see an angel.
Yeah, that's the same for God. In fact, I mean, people in the Bible are always talking about fear of God. God's always talking about fear of God. And, when God says, "fear me" in the Bible, he doesn't mean like have deep awe and respect for me. He means fear me. I'm going to kill you. But yeah, angels tell you, angels in the Bible. I mean, I want to be clear, whenever I talk about this stuff, God, angels, whatever, I am talking about, I get a lot of questions about this. I am talking about the characters in the ancient anthology we call the Bible. I'm not talking about something that I think is happening out there in the cosmos. So yeah, angels are very clear about who they are. When angels say, "do not fear," they don't mean I'm nice. They mean, "Hi, I can understand why you would be afraid, because we are usually going around slaughtering people. But in this particular instance, that's not why I'm here. So do not be afraid." Yes. It's very.
Think of all the Renaissance paintings of Mary at her prayer book. All of a sudden,
my versions of those paintings are a little bit different. Yeah,
a bit. Yeah.
I mean, what I've just said is very close to something I deal with in my angels chapter. Also, that I mean, we have these. There are beautiful stories about angels saying, "do not fear," except that there's a really terrible undertone also.
In terms of monsters too, I mean, a theoretician in me wants to talk about sort of the idea of taboo and transgression in relationship to these monsters, and how they've sort of like merged or disappeared for whatever political or sociocultural reason, which is probably way too much to get into right now. But it is an interesting idea how we've sort of like compelled ourselves to make cherubim these sweet heads with little wings, right?
Yeah.
On Valentine's Day cards.
Right.
But I feel like it's because the way that evangelical Christians have sort of like shifted in terms of interpretation, that we see that it becomes so totemic in belief that we have to do that, otherwise it is a taboo, and it becomes sort of more and more forbidden as it becomes grotesque.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Bible is so very different from what so many people want it to be. I think there's been a very strong and long-term, as I said, scrubbing, right? Like as if it has to be clean and good and show a good God doing all good things with all good divine beings at his beck and call. And that might be really nice, but it's not what's actually in the Bible, Hebrew Bible or New Testament, as I try to make clear over and over again. But I don't think that that's a bad thing. I don't think that that makes the Bible less valuable or less rich as literature. The Bible has not one message about God's goodness. No, there are people in the Bible, there are writers in the Bible who talk about God's goodness. Sure, great. There are beautiful texts. Those are there too. But the Bible is a rich, complex literary anthology, an array of voices, right? Voices reflecting on their very different experiences, and people thinking about their land and their people and their neighbors and their God and their neighbor's God and their neighbor's land, and how all of these things fit together. And many of those voices are in mild to moderate disagreement with one another. And that's because we're not reading like a Jack in the Box, open the book, here's the answer. When we open the Bible, if we do, what we see is an absolute wealth of many different people's reflections on the world and struggles with the world. And when we make monster movies and write monster stories, what are we doing? We're wrestling with the chaos and unpredictability of the world and the terrible things around us. The fact that the world can be unjust and monstrous. And the biblical writers wrestle with the same thing. So when I say that I think that these figures in the Bible are terrible and that God is monstrous in the Bible in some texts, that's not a slam on the Bible. That's, I think, recognition that the Bible itself reflects the same kinds of struggles that people have now. Which, I mean, we can see those struggles, in Greek mythology too. I think it makes the ancient literature more meaningful, more valuable, to think that it reflects different people's struggles and attempts to understand the world, than if it were just, Jack in the Box.
In terms of the struggle, you talk about at the end of the talk, but you say this wasn't the main address of the talk, that you wanted to, this has caused consternation for people and how they've had to approach the text.
Mhm.
And I'm curious if you could give us maybe a highlight reel of maybe like 3 examples of moments that have punctuated or come up that you think are anecdotally compelling around this struggle.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of what I think about that, really the highlight reel is what I just said, that when, so I teach at a seminary, and it's a somewhat diverse seminary in some ways. What that does mean is that I get to sit in a classroom with students who have very different theological views and religious/cultural positions from one another, which is wonderful for a seminar conversation, and of course more interesting for me as a teacher, year after year. But when I teach this material or any uncomfortable material from the Bible, for sure there are always some students who are initially not so not so comfortable with some of the more terrible, violent things from the Bible. And I think what I try to help students internalize, however they read the Bible. Like I don't care how different people feel about the Bible or read the Bible, but it's my job to help people think through it. It's your business what you think about it. So I try to help students internalize that biblical texts that are unpleasant, and like these in particular, where God and God's monsters in the Hebrew Bible and New Testament alike, and again, New Testament ratchets it up, that in these texts, we're not seeing something that a reader has to like take and put in their pocket and say, great, well, I guess that's true about God now. We're seeing texts that we might be able to relate to. And again, even as we might be able to relate to something we read, in the Odyssey, we're seeing ancient people's struggles. I clearly turned my notifications off until 9:25. We're seeing ancient people's struggles with the same kinds of things that we struggle with today. So if we try to scrub the Bible and water it down, we miss the beauty, we miss the poignancy of these ancient thinkers wrestling with what the hell is going on around them.
Your book is coming out in about a year, about 11 months. You're predicting.
I mean, I'm gonna say about a year. I have no idea. I don't have a date on that yet.
I can't hold up that one, but I can hold up this one.
Okay. Thanks.
So I do have one of your books here. I have to say I've enjoyed reading this book, and I look forward to reading the next.
Thank
and
you.
I've very, very much enjoyed this chat. And I've learned quite a bit more about these sort of, I don't know, creepy creatures of heaven that I was aware of, but
creepy for sure. And I'll just say the women's divination book is largely for a scholarly audience and people with some amount of background, maybe not necessarily a ton, but a little background, I think can certainly enjoy it. But the Biblical Monsters book is a popular book. No background necessary, fast and juicy.
Well, I'm sure many are looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to it. I'm always intrigued about these things. And now I definitely need to rethink my Halloween costume, I feel like.
Many eyes.
Right? Just like a peacock.
Yes.
So a big thank you again to Dr. Esther Hamori. Thank you for your patience with our cherubim tonight. I invite you all to
throwing
take
the coals in, I know.
I know. I invite you all to take the survey that Juan is dropping into the various chats. I also invite you to tune in tomorrow night for Dr. Ilya Karendorf and her presentation. And as always, stay spooky. Thank you so much once again.
Thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. Yeah, I can't wait, because I mean, the title alone, I was just like, there's so many pockets here.
Yeah, you know, the title, the subtitle is obviously too long.
It's long enough to be great again. That's the thing about it.
So, God's monsters, the hybrid creatures, vengeful spirits, deadly angels, ghosts, giants, sea monsters, demons, and divine hitmen of the Bible. I mean, it's obviously too long, but you can't just choose a couple. The others might get mad.
They might and attack your Zoom.
Exactly.
You never know what they're going to do.
Right.
Yeah, no, it's really fast, because I mean, my area of expertise in grad school, which has changed so much now to basically being a cultural historian, was 19th century art. And so the Romanticists were obsessed with all of these sort of forgotten or deliberately expurgated areas. And so it's interesting to see them resurfacing and people talking about them again. Yeah. We talk about Milton a lot, right? We talk about Milton and Lucifer being right in the 19th century. That's about it.
Yeah, they're fascinating. No, they're very compelling, and we see them coming up everywhere from Netflix to, well, me. So.
And like Supernatural too, right? Supernatural really went to the mind, because you should Lilith in Supernatural.
I